Few moments in television history create the kind of collective obsession that Ken Jennings sparked in the summer of 2004. Night after night, millions of Americans abandoned their routines to watch a soft-spoken software engineer from Utah do something that seemed impossible: win at Jeopardy again, and again, and again. His 74-game winning streak didn't just break records, it shattered what anyone thought possible in the world of televised trivia. But the phenomenon that made Ken Jennings a household name almost overnight would also become the very thing that complicated nearly every aspect of his life for the next 2 decades. What really happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded? Behind the celebrated mind and the record-breaking wins lies a far more complex story, one shaped by unexpected pressures, personal reckonings, public controversies, and a journey of reinvention that even Jennings himself couldn't have anticipated. When he first walked onto the Jeopardy stage, Ken Jennings was the definition of an unlikely celebrity. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune in any conventional sense. He was a trivia enthusiast who loved the challenge, a devoted husband and father living a quiet life far removed from the Hollywood spotlight. Yet within weeks, his face appeared on magazine covers, his name became a punchline on late-night television, and his every quirk was analyzed by an audience that seemed insatiable in their fascination. The winning streak that began as a personal triumph quickly transformed into something far larger and far stranger than anyone involved could have predicted. It became a cultural moment, a shared national experience that transcended the game show format entirely. But what the television audience saw was only a fraction of the story. Behind the calm demeanor and lightning-fast reflexes was a man grappling with forces beyond his control. The sudden fame brought opportunities, certainly book deals, speaking engagements, and invitations to exclusive events. Yet it also brought scrutiny of a kind that few quiz show contestants had ever endured. Every word he spoke, every opinion he shared, and every joke he made became fodder for public consumption and judgment. The pressure to maintain the image of the humble genius while navigating a world that suddenly demanded so much from him created tensions that would shape his path for years to come. As his streak finally ended on his 75th appearance, the question everyone asked was simple: what happens next? For Ken Jennings, the answer would prove far more complicated than any Jeopardy clue he ever faced. The defeat came not with drama but with characteristic grace. On November 30, 2004, when Nancy Zerg finally ended Ken Jennings' legendary run, he smiled, congratulated his opponent, and walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his 74 victories. But stepping into the aftermath of that moment meant entering a world that no previous game show contestant had ever inhabited. The media attention that had built steadily during his streak suddenly exploded into something approaching mania. Entertainment Tonight, Good Morning America, The Late Show, everyone wanted the Ken Jennings story, and they wanted it immediately. What they discovered was a man utterly unprepared for the role thrust upon him. The requests were relentless and bewildering. Publishers offered book deals for stories he wasn't sure he wanted to tell. Television producers pitched reality shows that felt alien to his sensibilities. Reporters called his home at all hours, asking questions that seemed to assume he had somehow planned for this level of fame. The disconnect between his internal experience and external expectations became a constant source of tension. He was still the same person who had walked onto that stage months earlier, a computer programmer who happened to know a lot of random facts. Yet the world seemed to demand something more, something bigger, something that fit their idea of what a celebrity should be. Perhaps most disorienting was the way his intellectual achievements became commodified. The mind that had always been his private sanctuary, the repository of curiosities and connections that brought him personal joy, suddenly belonged to the public in ways that felt invasive. Interviewers wanted to quiz him, to test his knowledge, to turn every conversation into a performance. The trivia that had once been a source of pleasure transformed into an expectation, a party trick that everyone assumed he was eager to display. The weight of constantly proving himself, of living up to an image that felt simultaneously accurate and entirely foreign, began to take its toll in ways he hadn't anticipated. Even more challenging was the realization that his 15 minutes of fame showed no signs of fading. Unlike other game show winners who briefly captured attention before returning to anonymity, Jennings found himself trapped in a public persona that seemed to have its own momentum. The Jeopardy champion had become bigger than the man himself, and disentangling the two would prove far more difficult than solving any television clue. The pressure to remain relevant while staying true to himself created an impossible balancing act that would define the next phase of his journey. As weeks turned to months, one thing became clear: the real challenge wasn't winning on Jeopardy, it was figuring out how to win at life after Jeopardy. The question that haunted Ken Jennings in those early months wasn't whether he could capitalize on his fame. Opportunities were everywhere. The question was whether he wanted to. Book publishers offered substantial advances for memoirs he felt too young to write. Television networks dangled hosting gigs that seemed designed more for his recognizable face than his actual interests. Speaking bureaus promised lucrative circuits addressing corporate audiences hungry for inspiration from America's most famous brainiac. Yet each opportunity felt like a step further away from the person he had been before the cameras started rolling. His first major decision proved both liberating and terrifying. He would write, but not about what everyone expected. Instead of churning out quick celebrity memoirs or trivia compilations, Jennings chose to explore the deeper culture of knowledge itself. His book Brainiac became a thoughtful meditation on curiosity, learning, and the peculiar subculture of competitive trivia. The process of writing forced him to examine not just his Jeopardy experience but his lifelong relationship with information and the communities that form around intellectual pursuit. It was deeply personal work disguised as cultural commentary, a way of reclaiming his narrative from the media machine that had threatened to define him entirely. But even as he found his voice as an author, the broader challenge of post-fame identity remained. The speaking engagements, while financially rewarding, often felt like elaborate exercises in nostalgia. Audiences wanted to hear about the streak, about the pressure, about what it felt like to be on television for those 74 nights. They were less interested in his thoughts on education, technology, or the future of knowledge in a digital age. He found himself performing a version of Ken Jennings that felt increasingly distant from his actual interests and concerns. The isolation was perhaps the most unexpected consequence of his celebrity. Old friendships became complicated by his public status. New relationships felt suspect. Were people genuinely interested in him or merely fascinated by what he represented? Even within the trivia community that had once been his natural home, dynamics shifted. He was no longer just another enthusiast, he had become the standard against which all others were measured, a position that was as lonely as it was burdensome. Most troubling was the growing realization that his moment might be finite. Unlike actors or musicians who could create new work to maintain relevance, his fame was tied to a singular achievement that was already receding into the past. Each month that passed meant another month further from his streak, another step toward potential irrelevance. The challenge wasn't just managing fame, it was preparing for its inevitable decline while somehow maintaining the sense of purpose and identity that had drawn him to trivia in the first place. The call that would change everything came at a moment when Ken Jennings had largely made peace with his post-Jeopardy existence. Years had passed since his streak ended, and he had carved out a respectable niche as an author and speaker, someone who could trade on his intellectual reputation without fully surrendering to the celebrity machinery. He had published multiple books, built a modest but loyal following, and learned to navigate the strange space between private person and public figure. Then Alex Trebek's diagnosis changed the entire landscape of the show that had made him famous. When Trebek announced his pancreatic cancer battle in 2019, the question of succession became unavoidable. For decades, Trebek had been the singular voice of Jeopardy, so synonymous with the show that imagining it without him seemed almost impossible. Yet as his condition worsened, the producers faced an unprecedented challenge: how do you replace the irreplaceable? The guest host experiment that followed Trebek's passing in November 2020 created opportunities that Jennings never could have anticipated, even as it thrust him back into a spotlight he thought he had left behind. His return to the Jeopardy stage as a guest host felt like a homecoming and a revelation simultaneously. Standing behind the podium that had once intimidated him, reading clues instead of answering them, Jennings discovered something unexpected: he was genuinely good at this. The years of media training, public speaking, and wrestling with his own relationship to the show had prepared him for a role he never knew he wanted. His hosting style reflected his journey: confident but not arrogant, knowledgeable but not condescending, and warm but not overly familiar. He understood the game from the inside in ways that few others could. But the guest hosting period also revealed the impossible expectations surrounding Trebek's successor. Every decision was scrutinized, every joke analyzed, and every interaction with contestants dissected by a fanbase that was both protective of the show's legacy and desperate for continuity. Jennings found himself not just auditioning for a job but serving as a bridge between the show's past and its uncertain future. The pressure was familiar yet different, no longer the pressure to win, but the pressure to honor something larger than himself while making it his own. The process forced him to confront questions about identity and purpose that went far beyond career considerations. Was he ready to tie his future so completely to the show that had already shaped so much of his life? Could he step out of Trebek's shadow while respecting his legacy? Most importantly, could he find genuine fulfillment in a role that would inevitably define him for the rest of his career? As the guest hosting rotation continued and the producers deliberated, Jennings faced the most significant choice of his post-streak life: whether to fully embrace the unexpected path that had opened before him. When Sony Pictures Television finally announced that Ken Jennings would become the permanent co-host of Jeopardy alongside Mayim Bialik in 2022, it marked the completion of one of the most unlikely career trajectories in television history. The software engineer who had stumbled into fame through a love of trivia had evolved into something no one, including himself, could have predicted: the guardian of an American institution. Yet the journey to that moment had required him to confront and ultimately transcend every assumption about who he was supposed to be. The man who now stands behind the Jeopardy podium bears little resemblance to the anxious contestant who first appeared in 2004, yet he remains fundamentally the same person in ways that matter most. The years between those two moments taught him that authenticity isn't about rejecting change, it's about remaining true to your core values while allowing experience to deepen your understanding of yourself. His hosting reflects this hard-won wisdom. He brings gravitas without pomposity, humor without undermining the game's integrity, and genuine enthusiasm for learning that resonates with contestants and viewers alike. Perhaps most remarkably, Jennings has managed to transform his relationship with fame from burden to tool. Where once the attention felt invasive and directionless, he now uses his platform to advocate for curiosity, intellectual humility, and the joy of lifelong learning. His social media presence, while occasionally controversial, reflects a willingness to engage with ideas and admit mistakes that feels refreshingly human in an age of manufactured celebrity perfection. He has become what the world needed him to be while somehow remaining what he always was. The deeper story of Ken Jennings isn't really about game shows or celebrity or even intelligence. It's about what happens when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose to grow rather than simply endure. His journey from contestant to host mirrors a broader transformation from someone who happened to be good at answering questions to someone who understands the deeper value of asking them. In a culture increasingly divided between those who claim to know everything and those who have given up on knowing anything, Jennings represents a third way: the possibility of intellectual confidence tempered by genuine humility. Today, as he continues to guide America's favorite quiz show through its next chapter, Ken Jennings embodies something rare in our public discourse: proof that it's possible to be smart without being arrogant, successful without losing your soul, and famous without forgetting where you came from. His story reminds us that the most profound victories aren't always the ones that happen in public, but the quiet triumphs of personal growth that prepare us for opportunities we never saw coming.